somewhere beneath the mud and mangrove roots of southern Cambodia and southern Vietnam, there lies a kingdom that once controlled the most lucrative sea routes on the planet. A kingdom whose ports welcomed ships from Rome, from Han China, from the distant shores of India and Persia. A kingdom that, according to ancient Chinese chronicles, commanded a fleet so vast it could darken the coastal waters of the Mekong Delta. And yet, if you asked 1,000 people on the street to name this empire, almost none of them could. Its name was Funan, and for roughly 500 years, it was one of the most powerful maritime states the world had ever seen. That fact alone should disturb us. Here was a civilization that sat at the crossroads of nearly every major trade network of the ancient world. Its merchants dealt in gold, silver, silk, spices, and perfumes. Its rulers built canal systems that stretched for dozens of miles through the floodplains, engineering works that rival anything constructed in the Mediterranean world during the same centuries. Its cities were described by visiting Chinese diplomats as teeming, sophisticated, and wealthy beyond easy measure. One Chinese envoy, writing in the 3rd century of the Common Era, described the people of Funan as living in walled cities, possessing palaces, and paying taxes in a structured system. He described a written legal code, a functioning bureaucracy, and a king who rode upon an elephant through streets, lined with wooden houses raised on stilts above the floodwaters. This was not a primitive outpost clinging to the margins of the known world. This was a thriving, complex state positioned at the very center of the ancient world's economic web. Its harbors were choked with vessels from a dozen different cultures. Its warehouses held goods that had traveled thousands of kilometers across open ocean. Its rulers exchanged diplomatic messages with the most powerful courts in Asia. To stand in one of Funan's port cities was to stand at the beating heart of global commerce, in an age when that commerce stretched from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. And then it vanished, not in a dramatic conflagration, not in a single battle or a sudden natural disaster that we can point to on a timeline. Funan simply faded from the written record, swallowed by the very landscape it had once mastered. The jungle crept in, the canals silted over, the wooden structures rotted in the tropical heat. Within a few generations, the memory of Funan was reduced to scattered references in Chinese court documents and a handful of inscriptions carved into stone. 5 centuries of wealth, trade, culture, and political power dissolved into the soft earth of the Mekong Delta, as though it had never existed at all. 500 years of accumulated knowledge, of engineering achievement, of diplomatic cunning and commercial ambition, absorbed back into the marshland like water poured onto sand. The ports fell silent, the warehouses emptied. The canals, once busy with flat-bottomed boats carrying rice and timber and trade goods from half the world, filled with sediment and weeds, and eventually disappeared beneath the surface of the delta, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Consider what that means. A maritime empire that lasted longer than the entire span of the British Empire. Longer than the Ottoman Empire held sway over southeastern Europe. Longer than the Roman Republic existed before it became an empire. Gone. Not conquered in any final sense, but absorbed, forgotten, overwritten by the civilizations that rose in its wake. The Khmer Empire, which most people associate with the magnificent temple of Angkor Wat, built its foundations on the very ground that Funan once ruled. But ask even the most dedicated student of Angkor about what came before, and you will often find silence. Funan is the ghost beneath the temple. It is the buried root system of a tree that the entire world admires without ever wondering what fed it. It is the first draft of a story that everyone knows, a draft so thoroughly discarded that no one remembers it was ever written. And that erasure, that completeness of forgetting, is itself a kind of mystery that demands an explanation, because civilizations of this scale do not normally vanish without leaving a deep scar on the collective memory. Something about the manner of Funan's disappearance was so total, so thorough, that it challenges our most basic assumptions about what it means for a society to exist. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why that silence matters. You are going to see how a civilization that connected Rome to China, that transformed the coastlines of Southeast Asia, that pioneered some of the earliest hydraulic engineering in tropical lowlands, was simply erased from the collective memory of humankind. You are going to learn what archaeologists have found in the soil of the Mekong Delta, what those discoveries tell us about the fragility of even the most prosperous human societies, and why the story of Funan may be the single most important cautionary tale that no one has ever told you. This is not a story about a minor kingdom in a forgotten corner of the world. This is a story about how entire worlds can disappear, and how the rest of us never even notice. It is a story about the things we build, the things we lose, and the terrifying ease with which centuries of human effort can be reduced to nothing more than silence and mud, and the faint outlines of walls beneath the earth. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let us begin. To understand what Funan was, and what its disappearance truly means, we first need to understand where it existed, and why that location matters more than almost any other place on the ancient map. The Mekong Delta, where Funan built its core territories, is one of the largest river deltas on Earth. It covers an area of roughly 39,000 square kilometers in the modern nations of Cambodia and Vietnam. During the monsoon season, the Mekong River swells with such force that it reverses the flow of the Tonle Sap River, flooding vast stretches of lowland and creating one of the most fertile agricultural zones in all of Asia. The soil is rich beyond measure. The water is abundant and predictable in its rhythms, and the coastline faces directly onto the South China Sea, which has served as the primary maritime corridor between East Asia and the Indian Ocean for thousands of years. This is the stage upon which Funan rose. Not a mountainous fortress kingdom defended by natural barriers, not a desert empire built around a single oasis, but a low-lying, water-soaked landscape where the distinction between land and sea blurred with every tide and every monsoon. The people who built Funan did not fight the water. They learned to use it. They channeled it through canals. They built their homes above it on wooden stilts. They navigated it in boats that served as the primary means of transportation across their territory. And in doing so, they created something that had never existed before in that region, a centralized state capable of projecting economic and military power across the open ocean and along the great rivers that fed the delta. The earliest references to Funan come from Chinese sources, particularly the records compiled during the period of the Three Kingdoms and the subsequent Jin dynasty. Chinese diplomats and merchants who travelled to the region between roughly the 1st century and the 6th century of the Common Era left behind written accounts that provide almost everything we know about Funan's political structure, its economy, and its culture. Without these Chinese records, Funan would be almost entirely invisible to history. The most important of these accounts were compiled by a diplomat named Kang Tai, who visited Funan sometime during the 3rd century, probably around 240 to 250 of the Common Era. Kang Tai travelled with another envoy named Zhu Ying, and together they produced reports that were later incorporated into the official histories of the Wu and Jin dynasties. Fragments of these reports survive in later Chinese historical compilations, and they describe a kingdom of considerable sophistication and complexity that clearly impressed its Chinese visitors. The name Funan itself deserves a moment of attention, because it tells us something important about the limitations of our knowledge. The word Funan is not what the people of this kingdom called themselves. It is a Chinese transcription, an approximation of a local word or phrase that Chinese diplomats heard and rendered into Chinese characters. The original word is believed by many scholars to have been related to the Old Khmer word Banam or Phnom, meaning mountain or hill, a word that survives today in the name of Cambodia's capital city, Phnom Penh. If this etymological connection is correct, then even the name by which we know this kingdom is a distortion, a foreign echo of a word that the Funanese people would barely have recognized as their own. We do not know what the people of Funan called their kingdom in their own language. We do not know what language they spoke in their daily lives, though it is generally assumed to have been an early form of Khmer, or a closely related Austroasiatic tongue. We do not know what songs they sang, or what stories they told, or what words they used to describe their own history. all of this has been lost. We are left with a Chinese approximation of a local name that may itself have been a Chinese misunderstanding, and we use this approximation as though it were the true name of a kingdom that endured for half a millennium. The irony is profound. The Chinese diplomatic records that form our primary written source for Funan's history contain a wealth of detail that, despite its limitations, provides an invaluable window into the kingdom's character. The Wu kingdom's envoys Kang Tai and Zhu Ying, who visited Funan in the mid-3rd century, described a society that impressed them with its organization and its material wealth. They reported that the kingdom encompassed numerous cities and towns, that its people lived in houses built on stilts above the floodwaters, that its markets were active and well supplied, and that its rulers maintained formal relations with neighboring kingdoms through a system of tribute and alliance. The Chinese accounts note that the king of Funan wore gold ornaments and presided over a court that included officials with defined roles and responsibilities. They describe a legal system that administered justice through a series of ordeals, including tests involving fire and water, methods that would have been recognizable to observers familiar with the legal traditions of many pre-modern societies. Later Chinese accounts add further layers of detail. Records from the Jin dynasty, the Liusong dynasty, and the Liang dynasty describe successive rulers of Funan, their military campaigns, their diplomatic interactions with the Chinese court, and their religious affiliations. One particularly noteworthy account describes the reign of a king named Jayavarman, who ruled Funan in the early 6th century, and who is described as a devout Buddhist who sent religious emissaries to China. This Jayavarman is sometimes identified as one of the last significant rulers of an independent Funan, and his reign may represent the final period of Funanese political coherence before the kingdom was absorbed by Chenla. The Chinese records also provide crucial information about Funan's military capabilities and territorial ambitions. Several accounts describe Funan as an expansionist power that extended its authority through military conquest, as well as through diplomatic marriage and alliance. One account claims that Funan, at its peak controlled vassal states that stretched as far south as the Malay Peninsula, giving the kingdom effective control over both sides of the sea routes that connected the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. If this claim is accurate, even approximately, then Funan's strategic reach was enormous, encompassing not just the Mekong Delta but significant portions of the maritime corridor that linked East and South Asia. The kingdom would have been not merely a regional power, but a key node in the geopolitical structure of the entire ancient Asian world. The religious dimension of Funan civilization is another area where our knowledge is growing but remains incomplete. The inscriptions and archaeological evidence indicate that Hinduism, particularly the Shaivite and Vaishnavite traditions, played a central role in the political and religious life of the kingdom's elite, but there is also evidence of Buddhist influence, particularly in the later centuries of Funan's existence. A 5th century Chinese account describes a Funanese monk named Nagasena who travelled to China and presented Buddhist texts to the Chinese court. This suggests that Buddhism was not merely present in Funan, but was actively promoted by members of the ruling class as a means of building diplomatic relationships with China, where Buddhism was gaining increasing influence during this period. The coexistence of Hindu and Buddhist traditions in Funan foreshadows the religious complexity that would characterize the later Khmer Empire, where kings alternated between Hindu and Buddhist affiliations, and where temples dedicated to different traditions were often built in close proximity to each other. According to Kang Tai and other Chinese sources, Funan was founded through a union between a local queen named Liu Ye, sometimes referred to as Queen Soma in later Indianized traditions, and a foreign figure named Kaundinya, described in some accounts as a Brahmin from India who arrived by sea carrying a sacred bow. The foundational myth states that Kaundinya arrived on the coast, defeated the local queen in a contest or confrontation of some kind, and married her, thereby establishing a dynasty that combined indigenous Southeast Asian authority with Indian religious and political concepts. Some versions of the story add that the queen was the daughter of a serpent deity, a naga, linking the founding myth to the deep-rooted Southeast Asian tradition of associating kingship with water spirits and subterranean powers. Whether this story reflects an actual historical event or a later mythological construction designed to legitimize the ruling class is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate that may never be fully resolved. What is clear, however, is that Funan, from its earliest recorded history, was a place where South Asian and Southeast Asian cultures met, merged, and produced something genuinely new. It was a hybrid civilization, drawing strength from multiple traditions, while belonging entirely to none of them. The scale of Funan's influence is difficult to grasp without placing it in careful context. At its peak, roughly during the 3rd through 5th centuries of the Common Era, Funan controlled a territory that extended from the southern tip of modern Vietnam westward across the Mekong Delta and into parts of modern Thailand and the Malay Peninsula. Some scholars, including the French historian Georges Coedes, who spent decades studying the Indianized states of Southeast Asia, estimated that Funan's sphere of influence, including vassal states and tributary partners, stretched across an enormous area. Other scholars, including Claude Jacques and Michael Vickery, have been more cautious in their assessments, noting that the exact boundaries of Funan's political control are extremely difficult to establish from the available evidence. But even the most conservative estimates place Funan among the largest and most significant political entities in Southeast Asian history prior to the rise of the Khmer Empire several centuries later. Its ports served as mandatory stopping points for ships traveling between China and India and between China and the Roman Empire's eastern trade networks. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, we must consider the mechanics of ancient maritime trade in the waters of Southeast Asia. Ships traveling from China to India could not simply sail in a straight line across the open ocean. The monsoon winds, which blow from the southwest during the summer months and from the northeast during the winter months, dictated the rhythm and timing of all long-distance voyages. Ships would leave Chinese ports during the northeast monsoon, sail south along the coast of Vietnam, and then stop at ports in the Mekong Delta region to wait for the winds to shift. This waiting period could last weeks or even months, during which time sailors would resupply their vessels, trade their cargo, repair their ships, and wait for favourable conditions. Once the southwest monsoon arrived, they could continue westward across the Bay of Bengal toward India, Sri Lanka, and the Persian Gulf beyond. This meant that every single ship on the China to India route had to stop somewhere along the coast of Southeast Asia, and Funan sat directly in the path of that mandatory pause. The economic implications of this geographic advantage were extraordinary. Funan's ports became warehouses for the ancient world, vast storage and redistribution facilities, where goods from multiple civilizations accumulated, were sorted, were taxed, and were sent onward to their final destinations. Goods from China, including silk textiles, lacquerware, bronze mirrors, and ceramic vessels, passed through Funan's harbours on their way west. Goods from India, including cotton textiles, gemstones, pearls, and religious artifacts such as bronze statues of Hindu deities, moved in the opposite direction. Goods from the Roman Empire's eastern trade networks, including glassware, coins, and Mediterranean wine sealed in distinctive amphora vessels, have been found in archaeological sites across the Mekong Delta. Roman coins dating to the 2nd century of the Common Era have been excavated at Oki Ao, the principal port city of Funan. A gold medallion bearing the image of the Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 of the Common Era, was discovered at this very site. And alongside this Roman artifact, excavators found intaglio gems, small carved stones used as seals, that bear unmistakable marks of Mediterranean craftsmanship. Think about what these objects mean. They travelled from the Mediterranean Sea, across the entire Indian Ocean, through the hands of countless traders and intermediaries, and came to rest in the mud of a Mekong Delta port city. The distance involved is roughly 12,000 kilometres. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, that journey would have taken many months, perhaps the better part of a year, passing through dozens of hands and multiple vessels. And yet these objects ended up in Funan. They tell us that Funan was not a peripheral kingdom, receiving occasional trickles of foreign goods. It was a central node in a commercial network that spanned the known world. The archaeological investigation of Funan's material culture has revealed a civilization that participated fully in the cultural and economic networks of the ancient world. Among the most remarkable findings are the carnelian and agate beads recovered from sites across the Mekong Delta. These beads, many of which show evidence of sophisticated drilling and polishing techniques, originated in workshops in what is now Gujarat, on the western coast of India. Their presence in the Mekong Delta confirms that Funan was connected not merely to the ports of the Indian subcontinent's eastern coast, which were its nearest Indian trading partners, but to the manufacturing centres of western India, more than 5,000 kilometres away by sea. The beads travelled from Gujarat to ports on India's eastern coast, and from there across the Bay of Bengal and through the maritime routes of Southeast Asia to the markets of the Mekong Delta. Each bead represents not just a commercial transaction, but a chain of human relationships stretching across an ocean, relationships of trust, credit, and mutual obligation that made long-distance trade possible in an era without banking systems, insurance, or enforceable international contracts. The tin and bronze objects found at Funan sites tell a similar story of far-flung connections. Tin, an essential component of bronze, was not locally available in the Mekong Delta and had to be imported, most likely from the tin-bearing regions of the Malay Peninsula or the islands of what is now Indonesia. The production of bronze objects in Funan thus required participation in a multi-step supply chain that began with tin mining in one location, smelting and alloying in another, and final production in the workshops of the Delta. The organizational complexity implied by this supply chain is significant. It required not only the technical knowledge of metallurgy, but the commercial infrastructure to acquire raw materials from distant sources, the financial systems to fund long-distance procurement, and the transportation networks to move heavy materials across hundreds of kilometers of ocean and river. Funan was not merely a passive beneficiary of this trade. It actively managed, facilitated, and taxed the flow of goods through its territory. Chinese sources describe Funan's rulers as demanding tribute and port fees from passing vessels, and maintaining a navy capable of enforcing their authority over the surrounding waters. The kingdom's wealth was not simply agricultural, though the rich delta soils certainly produced abundant rice to feed a large population. It was commercial. Funan was, in essence, a toll booth positioned at one of the most critical choke points in the ancient global economy. Every ship that entered its waters contributed to its treasury. Every monsoon season that forced sailors to wait in its harbours brought fresh revenue, fresh information, and fresh cultural exchange. Now, let us place Funan's lifespan in perspective, because the scale comparisons are essential to understanding the magnitude of what was lost. If we accept the conventional dating, Funan existed as a recognizable political entity from roughly the 1st century of the Common Era to the 6th century, a span of approximately 500 years. To make that number real, consider this. If you compress the entire existence of Funan into a single human lifetime of 75 years, every year of Funan's existence would represent roughly 1.8 months of that person's life. The kingdom would have been born as an infant, grown through childhood, reached the peak of its powers in middle age, and declined into old age and death, all within the span of one imagined human life. But here is the second comparison. The Roman Empire in the West lasted, from the traditional founding of Rome as a republic to the fall of the Western Empire, roughly 1,000 years. Funan's 500 years represent half of Rome's total span. The British Empire, measured from its earliest permanent overseas colonies in the early 17th century to the major decolonization movements of the mid-20th century, lasted roughly 350 years. Funan outlasted the British Empire by a century and a half, and a third comparison makes the point even sharper. The amount of knowledge we possess about Rome fills libraries that stretch for miles. The amount of knowledge we possess about Funan would fit comfortably on a single bookshelf. The ratio of knowledge preserved to civilization lived is perhaps one of the most extreme in all of recorded history. The archaeological investigation of Funan is itself a story worth telling because it reveals how recently we began to take this civilization seriously and how much of its story was nearly lost forever. The first modern Western scholar to identify Funan as a distinct historical entity was the French historian and sinologist Paul Pelliot, who in the early 20th century systematically translated and analysed the Chinese textual references to the kingdom. Pelliot, working from the Chinese dynastic histories available in European libraries, established the basic outline of Funan's chronology and political geography. His work was painstaking and foundational, but for decades after its publication, Funan remained primarily a textual entity, a kingdom that existed in books but not yet in the ground. That began to change in the 1940s, when the French archaeologist Louis Malloret undertook the first systematic excavation of Oki-Io, the site identified as Funan's principal port. Malloret's work, conducted during the final years of French colonial rule in Indochina, revealed a site of extraordinary richness. Oki-Io, located in what is now An province in southern Vietnam, was not merely a small coastal settlement. It was a major urban centre connected to the surrounding landscape by an elaborate network of canals. Malloret's excavations uncovered gold jewellery of exquisite craftsmanship, tin, amulets bearing Hindu iconography, gemstones, glass beads from the Mediterranean and Indian worlds, ceramic fragments from multiple civilizations, and the Roman artifacts that would later become the most famous evidence of Funan's far-reaching trade connections. But Malloret's work was interrupted by war. The First Indochina War, followed by the decades-long Vietnam War, made sustained archaeological work in the Mekong Delta impossible for a generation. The sites that Malloret had identified sat untouched, unprotected, and in some cases damaged by military operations, while the landscape around them was scarred by conflict. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that serious fieldwork resumed, led by Vietnamese, Cambodian, Japanese, and other international scholars. What they found confirmed and dramatically expanded Malloret's original discoveries. The canal system was far more extensive than anyone had initially believed. Aerial photographs and satellite imagery revealed a network of artificial waterways stretching across the delta in every direction, connecting inland agricultural zones to coastal ports and linking major settlement sites to each other. Some of these canals extended for more than 80 kilometers. Others were shorter, but no less significant, serving as local arteries within individual communities and agricultural districts. Together, they formed a hydraulic infrastructure of remarkable scale. The engineering required to build and maintain such a system in a tropical floodplain cannot be overstated. The Mekong Delta is not a stable landscape. It floods every year during the monsoon. It deposits enormous quantities of sediment that constantly reshape the terrain. It shifts its channels unpredictably. Building permanent canals in such an environment requires constant maintenance, organized labor on a large scale, centralized planning and coordination, and a deep institutional knowledge of local hydrology accumulated over generations. The fact that Funan accomplished this over a period of centuries tells us that we are dealing with a state of considerable organizational sophistication. This was not a loose confederation of fishing villages. This was a genuine hydraulic civilization, organized around the construction and upkeep of water management systems, comparable in its fundamental logic to ancient Egypt along the Nile or Mesopotamia along the Tigris and Euphrates. The discoveries at Oki-Io also included brick foundations that appear to represent temple structures dedicated to Hindu deities. These foundations, combined with Sanskrit inscriptions found at other sites across the Mekong Delta and in the lower reaches of the Mekong River Valley, indicate that Funan's ruling elite practiced both Hinduism and Buddhism. Sanskrit inscriptions found in Cambodia's Takeo province, dating to the 5th century of the Common Era, provide some of the earliest examples of Sanskrit being used for political purposes anywhere in Southeast Asia. These inscriptions record the names of kings, the dedication of temples, and the granting of land to religious establishments. They are among the most precious documents we have for understanding Funan's inner life, and each new inscription discovered in the field adds another fragile thread to the tapestry of our knowledge. The site of Angkor Boré in Takeo Province has provided perhaps the most sustained window into Funan's world. Excavations led by Miriam Stark of the University of Hawaii have revealed a settlement occupied continuously for over 1,000 years. The site shows evidence of increasingly complex social organization over time, with brick construction, imported luxury goods, and Sanskrit inscriptions all appearing during the period associated with Funan's peak. Angkor Boré may have served as one of Funan's inland administrative centers, and its stratigraphic record, the layers of occupation visible in the excavation trenches, provides a chronological backbone for understanding the kingdom's trajectory from rise to decline. But here is the uncomfortable truth that lies beneath all of these discoveries. For all that we have learned, our understanding of Funan remains fragmentary, systematically biased, and dependent on the perspectives of outsiders and elites. The Chinese accounts describe Funan through the lens of Chinese imperial priorities. The Sanskrit inscriptions speak with the voice of kings and priests, not farmers and fishermen, and the archaeological record preserves only the most durable fraction of Funan's material culture. In a tropical delta, wood rots, cloth disintegrates, and organic materials vanish. What survives is stone, brick, metal, and ceramic. Everything else, which is to say most of what constituted daily life in Funan, is gone beyond recovery. We are looking at Funan through a keyhole, and beyond that keyhole, the room is mostly dark. We can make out shapes, we can sense the scale of what was there, but the details, the textures, the colours, the sounds, the smell of the marketplace, the chanting in the temples, the creak of boats on the canals, all of this is lost. We know that Funan existed. We know that it was wealthy and powerful, but we do not truly know it, and we likely never will. And this is where the central question emerges, the question that will occupy us for the remainder of this journey. How does a civilization of this magnitude simply disappear? How does a 500-year-old maritime empire, positioned at the most important trade crossroads in the ancient world, fade so completely that most of humanity has never heard its name? What happened to Funan? And what does its disappearance tell us about the permanence of everything we build? The answer, as we are about to see, is far more unsettling than a simple tale of conquest or catastrophe. The traditional narrative of Funan's decline goes something like this. Sometime during the 6th century of the Common Era, a vassal state known as Chenla, located in the inland regions north of the Mekong Delta along the middle reaches of the Mekong River, rose in power and gradually absorbed Funan's territories. Chinese historical records note that by approximately 550 of the Common Era, Funan had ceased to send tribute missions to the Chinese court, and that by the late 6th century, Chenla had replaced it as the dominant power in the region. The transition is sometimes described as a military conquest, sometimes as a gradual political absorption in which Funan's ruling dynasty was simply replaced by a new one from the north. The Chinese sources are frustratingly vague on the details, offering bare chronological markers without the narrative context that would allow us to understand the process in any depth. And the local inscriptions from this transitional period are few and difficult to interpret with confidence. What is clear is that by the early 7th century, the name Funan had disappeared from the diplomatic record, replaced by Chenla, and later by the Khmer Empire that emerged from Chenla's fracturing and eventual reunification. For a long time, scholars treated this transition as relatively straightforward. One kingdom rose, another fell. The cycle of dynastic succession that characterizes so much of Asian political history simply played out in the Mekong Delta as it had played out in China, in India, and across the ancient world. Funan declined, Chenla ascended, and the story moved on. George Coedes, the great French historian of Southeast Asia, who dedicated much of his career to mapping the Indianized states of the region, described the process in precisely these terms: a transfer of political authority from a coastal, maritime-oriented state to an inland, agrarian-oriented one. It was tidy, it was comprehensible, and for decades it was accepted as the standard account. But here is the problem. The archaeological evidence does not support such a tidy narrative. When researchers examined the sites associated with Funan's core territory in the Mekong Delta, they did not find evidence of sudden destruction, mass burning, or military devastation consistent with a dramatic conquest. There are no burn layers at Okieo. There are no mass graves. There are no destroyed fortifications. What they found instead was something more gradual, and in many ways far more disturbing than any military defeat. They found evidence of abandonment. The canals silted up. The port facilities fell into disuse. The urban centres shrank year by year, decade by decade, and eventually emptied. Oki, the great port that had once connected China to Rome, simply ceased to function as a major city. Not because it was destroyed by an invading army, but because the conditions that had sustained it slowly and irreversibly changed. The most compelling explanation that has emerged in recent decades focuses not on military conquest at all, but on environmental and economic transformation. The historian Michael Vickery, who spent decades studying early Cambodian history and who was known for his willingness to challenge established narratives, argued that the decline of Funan was closely linked to changes in regional trade patterns. During the early centuries of the Common Era, the maritime route between China and India depended heavily on coastal navigation and on the monsoon-driven stopping points along the Southeast Asian coast. Funan's entire economic model was built on this dependency. Its wealth derived from its position along this coastal route. But as navigational technology improved over the centuries, and as sailors gained greater confidence and better vessels for making longer open ocean crossings, the need to stop in the Mekong Delta diminished. Ships that had once been forced to wait in Funan's ports for the monsoon winds to shift began to bypass the delta entirely, sailing directly across the South China Sea to the Malay Peninsula or to the Strait of Malacca, where the emerging kingdoms of Srivijaya and others were beginning to offer competing port facilities. If this theory is correct, then Funan's decline was not caused by a foreign army marching in from the north. It was caused by a shift in maritime technology and trade geography that rendered the kingdom's entire economic model obsolete. The analogy that comes to mind is a great city built at a mountain pass, a city that thrived for centuries because every traveller had to pass through it. Then one day, someone discovered a tunnel through the mountain. The pass was still there. The city was still there, but no one needed to come through anymore. The merchants went elsewhere. The revenue dried up, and the city, bereft of its economic purpose, slowly emptied, and it gets worse. The environmental dimension of Funan's decline is equally troubling and equally difficult to attribute to any single event or cause. The Mekong Delta is a dynamic, unstable landscape built from sediment deposited by the Mekong River over millennia. Its topography changes constantly as the river shifts its channels, deposits new material, and erodes existing landforms. Sea levels in the region have fluctuated significantly over the past 2,000 years. Some researchers have proposed that changes in the Mekong's flow patterns during the 5th and 6th centuries may have fundamentally altered the hydrology of the canal systems that Funan depended upon. If the river's main channels shifted, the canals that connected Funan's inland agricultural zones to its coastal ports could have become unworkable, either because their water sources dried up or because new flooding patterns overwhelmed them. Without functioning canals, the entire economic system that linked rice production in the interior to maritime trade on the coast would have collapsed like a chain with a broken link. Research conducted by Miriam Stark and other environmental historians working in the Mekong Delta has demonstrated that the settlement patterns in the region shifted significantly between the 5th and 7th centuries. Population centres moved away from the coastal zones associated with Funan and toward the inland areas to the north that would later form the heartland of the Khmer Empire. This demographic shift suggests that the environmental and economic conditions in the delta were deteriorating, pushing people inland toward higher ground, more reliable water sources, and new economic opportunities. The movement was not sudden. It was gradual, unfolding over generations, which is precisely what makes it so hard to see in the archaeological record. A population that moves all at once leaves a clear signal. A population that trickles away over a century leaves almost nothing. The implications of this are profound and deeply unsettling. Funan may not have been conquered in any meaningful military sense at all. It may simply have been rendered obsolete. Its trade routes shifted, its canals failed, its agricultural base eroded, and its population, faced with declining economic opportunities and deteriorating environmental conditions, simply moved to wherever life was more viable. The kingdom did not fall in battle. It drained away, like water seeping out of a cracked vessel, slowly, silently, and almost invisibly. This pattern of decline represents one of the most disturbing modes of civilizational collapse that we know of. We are accustomed to thinking of great societies ending in dramatic fashion. Rome was sacked by Visigoths. The Aztec Empire was destroyed by Spanish conquistadors, armed with steel and disease. The city of Pompeii was buried beneath volcanic ash in a single afternoon. These are vivid, comprehensible endings. They have villains and victims, clear causes and clear effects. They make good stories. But Funan's disappearance fits none of these categories. There was no single catastrophe. There was no identifiable enemy. There was only a slow, grinding process of marginalization, as the conditions that had given rise to the kingdom gradually ceased to exist. No one declared war on Funan. The monsoon winds simply found a different path across the sea. This type of decline is particularly difficult for archaeologists to study because it leaves few dramatic traces in the ground. A city destroyed by fire leaves a burn layer that can be precisely dated. A city flooded by a tsunami leaves a distinctive sediment deposit. A city overwhelmed by earthquake leaves collapsed walls and crushed pottery. But a city abandoned over the course of several generations leaves almost nothing. The buildings decay. The artifacts are carried away by departing residents who take their most valuable possessions with them. The site is gradually reclaimed by vegetation and sediment. What remains after a century or two of abandonment are the most durable elements: stone foundations, brick walls, fired ceramics, and metal objects. Everything else, which is to say the vast majority of a city's material existence, vanishes. At Okio, the excavation teams led by Vietnamese archaeologists in the 1990s and early 2000s found exactly this pattern. The site showed no evidence of catastrophic destruction at any point in its history. Instead, it showed a gradual thinning of occupation layers in the upper strata, a decline in the quantity and quality of imported goods, and an eventual cessation of new construction activity. The city did not die in a single night. It died over the course of decades, perhaps over the course of 2 or 3 generations, as fewer and fewer people found reasons to live and work there. The last residents of Ok-Io did not flee a burning city. They simply did not come back from wherever they had gone. The inscriptions tell a similar story, though from a different angle. The Sanskrit inscriptions associated with Funan's ruling dynasty become progressively fewer during the 5th and 6th centuries. The last known inscription that can be confidently attributed to a Funan king dates to approximately the early 6th century. After that date, the epigraphic record shifts to rulers associated with Chenla or with local polities that no longer acknowledged Funan's authority. The silence of these inscriptions is itself evidence of a particular kind. When kings stop commissioning inscriptions, it usually means that their power has contracted to the point where such public displays of authority are no longer meaningful or affordable. The Chinese diplomatic records provide the most explicit chronological framework for Funan's decline. The Liang dynasty history, compiled in the 7th century based on earlier records, notes that Funan sent its last tribute mission to the Chinese court around 539 of the Common Era. After that date, the Chinese records begin to refer to the region using different political names, indicating that the entity known as Funan was no longer recognized as a sovereign state by its most important diplomatic partner. The transition in Chinese nomenclature from Funan to Chenla occurs gradually over the course of the 6th century, suggesting that the change was incremental rather than sudden. There was no dramatic announcement. There was just a slow fading of one name and the gradual emergence of another. The question of when exactly Funan began its decline is itself contested, because the available evidence can be read in multiple ways depending on which sources one prioritizes and which theoretical framework one brings to the analysis. Some scholars, following the Chinese records closely, place the beginning of the end in the early 6th century, when the frequency of tribute missions to the Chinese court began to decline. Others drawing on archaeological evidence, argue that the process began earlier, perhaps in the late 5th century, when certain Mekong Delta sites show evidence of reduced habitation and diminished trade activity. Still others contend that the decline was not a single linear process but a series of fluctuations, with periods of relative recovery interrupting the general downward trend, much like a patient whose illness includes temporary improvements that mask the underlying trajectory. The historian Pierre-Yves Manguin, who has spent decades studying the maritime history of Southeast Asia, has proposed a nuanced model that integrates both the economic and environmental factors. Manguin argues that Funan's decline must be understood in the context of a broader transformation of the maritime trade system in Southeast Asia during the 5th through 7th centuries. During this period, the center of gravity of maritime commerce shifted from the ports of the Mekong Delta to the ports of the Malay Peninsula and the islands of what is now Indonesia, particularly the emerging power of Srivijaya on the island of Sumatra. Srivijaya, which rose to prominence during the 7th century, occupied a position at the western end of the maritime route that was in many ways analogous to Funan's position at the eastern end. But Srivijaya had a crucial advantage. It sat directly astride the Strait of Malacca, the narrow waterway that separates the Malay Peninsula from Sumatra, and that provides the most direct passage between the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. As navigational technology improved, and as ships became capable of making the direct crossing from southern China to the Strait of Malacca without stopping along the Vietnamese coast, the Mekong Delta ports lost their competitive advantage. The trade that had sustained Funan for centuries now flowed through different channels. Manguin's argument is supported by archaeological evidence from multiple sites along the Southeast Asian coast. Port sites in the Mekong Delta show declining activity during the 5th and 6th centuries, while port sites on the Malay Peninsula and in the Indonesian archipelago show increasing activity during the same period. The pattern is consistent with a geographic shift in the trade routes, a shift that left Funan stranded on the wrong side of the commercial map. But trade route shifts alone may not fully explain the completeness of Funan's disappearance. Other maritime kingdoms in history have lost their commercial advantages and survived in diminished form, adapting to new economic realities while maintaining their cultural and political identity. Venice, for example, lost its dominance of the Mediterranean spice trade after the Portuguese established a direct sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498. Venice declined, but it did not vanish. It survived as a republic for another 3 centuries, adapting its economy and maintaining its cultural identity. Why did Funan not do the same? Why was its decline so complete that the kingdom itself ceased to exist, rather than merely shrinking to a smaller, less powerful, but still recognizable form? One possible answer lies in the nature of Funan's political organization. Some scholars have argued that Funan was not a tightly unified kingdom in the way that the Chinese sources imply, but rather a loose confederation of local chiefdoms and city-states, united under the nominal authority of a paramount king. In this model, sometimes called the Mandala model of Southeast Asian political organization, the power of the central ruler was strongest in the core territory around the capital, and weakened progressively with distance. Peripheral regions owed allegiance to the center primarily through personal relationships between local chiefs and the paramount king, relationships that were maintained through gift exchange, tribute, intermarriage, and the threat of military force. If the paramount king's power weakened, whether through economic decline, military defeat, or simply a succession crisis, the peripheral chiefs would redirect their allegiance to a more powerful patron, and the confederacy would fragment. If this model accurately describes Funan's political structure, then the kingdom's decline becomes easier to understand, though no less sobering. A confederacy held together by the personal authority and economic resources of the paramount king would be particularly vulnerable to economic shocks. As trade revenues declined and the canal system deteriorated, the king's ability to maintain the networks of patronage and alliance that held the kingdom together would have diminished correspondingly. Local chiefs who had previously acknowledged Funan's authority would have found it increasingly advantageous to align themselves with the rising power of Chenla to the north. The process would have been gradual, with peripheral regions drifting away first, and the core territory shrinking slowly over the course of decades. Eventually, the centre itself would have lost the capacity to function as a seat of paramount authority, and the name Funan would have ceased to carry any political meaning. This interpretation helps explain a feature of Funan's decline that has puzzled scholars: the apparent absence of a final military defeat. If Funan was a confederacy that fragmented from the edges inward, there would have been no need for Chenla conquer it in a decisive military campaign. Chenla simply absorbed it, community by community, chief by chief, as the old allegiances dissolved and new ones formed. The process was political rather than military, economic rather than violent, and political and economic processes, by their nature, leave fewer archaeological traces than wars and conquests. There is a further complication that deepens the mystery. The very name Chenla, the kingdom that is said to have replaced Funan, is itself a subject of scholarly debate. Like Funan, the name Chenla is a Chinese transcription that does not correspond to any known local term. Some scholars have questioned whether Chenla was a distinct political entity at all, or whether the Chinese records simply grouped a collection of inland Khmer polities under a single convenient label. Michael Vickery, who was particularly skeptical of the received narrative, argued that the transition from Funan to Chenla was not a case of one kingdom conquering another, but rather a gradual shift in the political centre of gravity from the coast to the interior, accompanied by changes in political terminology that the Chinese records interpreted, perhaps incorrectly, as a change in dynasty or state. In Vickery's view, the people and cultures of the Mekong Delta region did not change dramatically between the 6th and 7th centuries. What changed was the location of political authority and the commercial basis of the economy. The coastal, trade-oriented model that Funan represented gave way to an inland, agriculture-oriented model that Chenla, or whatever we choose to call it, represented. The people were largely the same. The landscape was largely the same. But the economic logic had shifted, and with it, the political geography. If Vickery is right, then the disappearance of Funan is even more poignant than the traditional narrative suggests, because it means that Funan's people did not go anywhere. They stayed in the delta, or they moved short distances to more viable locations within the same general region. They continued to farm rice, to fish, to build houses on stilts, to worship their gods. What they lost was not their homes or their lives, but their kingdom, the political structure that had given their communities a collective identity and a place in the diplomatic order of the ancient world. The kingdom dissolved, but the people endured. And in enduring, they lost the thing that had made them visible to history, the centralized authority that could send tribute missions to China, commission inscriptions in Sanskrit, and build the monumental structures that archaeologists would later search for. Without that authority, the people of the Mekong Delta became invisible again, their lives continuing, but their history ceasing to be recorded. Something is deeply wrong with our assumptions about how civilizations end. We tend to look for the decisive moment, the battle, the invasion, the earthquake, the eruption. But Funan suggests that the most complete form of disappearance is the gradual one. A society that collapses slowly leaves fewer traces than one that collapses suddenly. A city abandoned over 50 years is harder to find than a city buried under lava in an afternoon. And a culture that fades through economic marginalization and environmental change is harder to mourn than one that is violently destroyed. Because violence creates a story. Gradual decline creates only silence. There is another critical dimension to the problem of Funan's disappearance, and it concerns the nature of the surviving evidence itself. Almost everything we know about Funan comes from two types of sources: Chinese diplomatic records and local inscriptions in Sanskrit. Both of these sources represent the perspectives of elites. The Chinese sources reflect the interests and biases of imperial officials concerned primarily with trade, tribute, and diplomatic protocol. The Sanskrit inscriptions reflect the concerns of Funan's ruling class and its priestly establishment. Neither source gives us access to the perspectives of ordinary Funanese people. the rice farmers, the canal diggers, the fishermen, the weavers, the boat builders, the artisans and labourers who constituted the vast majority of the population. Their voices have been completely and permanently silenced by the passage of time. The loss of Funan's internal written records is a catastrophe whose magnitude cannot be overstated. Every civilization that has left behind a substantial written archive, Egypt with its papyri, Mesopotamia with its clay tablets, China with its bamboo strips and silk scrolls, Greece and Rome with their manuscripts, has given future generations the ability to reconstruct its history, its thought, and its inner life in rich and revealing detail. But civilizations that left no such archive, or whose archives were written on perishable materials that disintegrated in tropical conditions, become shadows on the wall of history. We can trace their outlines through external accounts and through the mute testimony of archaeological remains, but we cannot hear them speak in their own voices. Funan belongs to this category of the permanently silenced. It existed, it thrived, it traded with the mightiest empires of its age, and it left behind almost nothing that allows us to know it as its own people knew it. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. Funan is not an isolated case, it is a pattern. Across the ancient world, along every major coastline and every major river system in the tropics, there are blank spaces in the historical record where complex societies once existed and then vanished beyond recovery. The Mekong Delta is one such blank space. The coast of East Africa, where the Swahili trading cities once connected the African interior to the Indian Ocean world, is another. The river systems of the Amazon basin, where recent LiDAR surveys have revealed the outlines of enormous geometric earthworks and settlement complexes, represent yet another. In each of these places, the combination of tropical climate, perishable building materials, and the absence of a durable written record has conspired to erase entire civilizations from human memory. Funan is simply the most well-documented example of a phenomenon that may have occurred hundreds of times across the span of human history, and each occurrence represents a permanent loss, not just of buildings and artifacts, but of knowledge, of perspective, of ways of being human that can never be recovered. To truly grasp the significance of Funan's disappearance, we must place it alongside other civilizations that have vanished in similar ways, examine the various theories scholars have proposed for these patterns of collapse, and test each theory against the evidence. The pattern is disturbingly consistent, but the causes are varied, and no single explanation accounts for all of them. Each case illuminates a different facet of the problem, and each case also reveals the limitations of our current understanding. Let us begin with the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the most striking examples of civilizational disappearance in the entire archaeological record. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization after one of its principal cities, flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India from approximately 2600 to 1900 years before the Common Era, a span of roughly 700 years. At its peak, it was one of the three great civilizations of the Bronze Age world, alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. Its two largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were among the most sophisticated urban centers of their era, featuring standardized brick construction, elaborate multi-level drainage systems, large public baths, centralized granaries, and streets laid out in precise grid patterns. The population of the Indus Valley civilization has been estimated at approximately 5 million people, making it the largest urban civilization of its age by a significant margin. And then, around 1900 years before the Common Era, it collapsed. The great cities were abandoned within a few generations. The standardized systems of weights, measures, and urban planning that had characterized Harappan culture for centuries disappeared. The sophisticated writing system, which had been used on thousands of seals, tablets, and other objects, ceased to be employed. The population dispersed into smaller, less complex, and more widely scattered settlements. Within a few centuries, the memory of the Indus Valley civilization was so completely lost that it was not rediscovered until British railway engineers stumbled upon the ruins of Harappa in the 1850s. While quarrying bricks for a railway line, for roughly 3,500 years, one of the greatest civilizations in human history, existed in a state of total oblivion, its cities buried beneath accumulated sediment, its writing undeciphered, its people forgotten. The parallels with Funan are both instructive and haunting. Like Funan, the Indus Valley civilization left behind no decipherable written record. The Indus script, found on thousands of seals and small objects, has never been successfully translated, despite more than a century of scholarly effort. Like Funan, the Indus Valley civilization appears to have declined gradually, rather than collapsing in a single catastrophic event. There are no burn layers at Mohenjo-daro, no evidence of military conquest. Instead, there is evidence of gradual depopulation, declining urban maintenance, and eventual abandonment. And like Funan, the Indus Valley civilization was located in a region where environmental conditions were subject to significant and unpredictable change. Current research suggests that shifts in monsoon patterns and major changes in river hydrology, particularly the drying up or shifting of the Gagahakra river system, may have undermined the agricultural foundations that sustained Harappan cities, forcing populations to disperse. The specific environmental mechanism is different from Funan's, but the underlying dynamic, a civilization unable to survive changes in the conditions it depends upon, is hauntingly similar. The Indus Valley case also introduces us to a critical methodological problem that applies directly to Funan. When a civilization leaves no decipherable written record, we are forced to reconstruct its history entirely from material remains, from the objects and structures that survive the corrosive effects of time and climate. But material remains are not evenly distributed across the activities of a civilization. They preserve some things and destroy others, and the pattern of preservation is not random. It is systematically biased in ways that distort our picture of the past. Stone survives. Metal survives, at least partially. Ceramics survive almost indefinitely. But wood does not survive, at least not in tropical climates. Textiles do not survive. Food does not survive. Paper and palm leaf do not survive. And in a civilization like Funan, where the primary building materials were wood and thatch, where records may have been kept on perishable organic materials, and where the tropical climate accelerates the decay of everything that is not stone or metal, the bias of preservation is extreme. What we find at Funan's archaeological sites is not a representative sample of what once existed there. It is the thin residue of durable materials that happen to resist the particular combination of heat, humidity, microbial activity, and seasonal flooding that characterizes the Mekong Delta environment. We are, in essence, trying to reconstruct a symphony from a few surviving notes, most of which happen to be from the brass section, simply because brass instruments are more durable than violins. This problem of differential preservation is compounded by a further difficulty that is specific to delta environments. River deltas are geologically active landscapes. They are built by the continuous deposition of sediment carried downstream by the river, and they are simultaneously eroded and reshaped by the action of tides, currents, and storm surges. Over centuries and millennia, the surface of a delta rises, shifts, and rearranges itself in ways that can bury, destroy, or displace the remains of earlier human habitation. Archaeological sites in the Mekong Delta are not sitting placidly beneath a few meters of accumulated soil, waiting to be uncovered by patient excavation. They are embedded within a dynamic geological matrix that has been in continuous motion for thousands of years. Canals that were once on the surface may now be buried beneath meters of alluvial sediment. Buildings that once stood near the river may now be far from any watercourse, or they may have been destroyed entirely by changes in the river's path. The landscape itself has been rewritten since Funan's time, and the archaeological record has been rewritten with it. This brings us to a remarkable parallel that is often overlooked in discussions of civilizational collapse. The kingdom of Aksum, which flourished in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea from roughly the 1st century to the 7th century of the Common Era. Aksum is in many ways Funan's mirror image, a great trading kingdom of the ancient world that occupied a strategic position on the maritime routes connecting the Roman Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean and the markets of South and East Asia. The port of Adulis, Aksum's gateway to the sea, was located on the coast of the Red Sea, in what is now Eritrea, and it served as a critical link in the chain of commerce that extended from the Egyptian port of Berenik through the Red Sea to the western coast of India and beyond. Aksumite merchants exported ivory, gold, rhinoceros horn, and other luxury goods from the East African interior, and they imported textiles, metals, wine, and olive oil from the Mediterranean world. The kingdom minted its own coinage in gold, silver, and bronze, one of only a handful of sub-Saharan African polities to do so in the ancient world, and this coinage has been found at archaeological sites as far away as India, confirming the reach of Aksumite commercial networks. Like Funan, Aksum was profoundly shaped by the religious and cultural currents of the wider world. In the 4th century, under King Ezana, Aksum became one of the earliest kingdoms in the world to adopt Christianity as an official religion, a conversion that linked the kingdom culturally and diplomatically to the Christian Roman Empire, and that has had lasting consequences for the religious identity of the Ethiopian highlands. Like Funan, Aksum left behind monumental architecture, most notably the massive stone stelae or obelisks at the capital city, some of which exceed 20 meters in height and are among the largest single blocks of stone ever quarried and erected in the ancient world. And like Funan, Aksum's decline appears to have been driven not by a single catastrophic event, but by a gradual shift in the economic and environmental conditions that had sustained the kingdom. The rise of Islam in the 7th century transformed the political geography of the Red Sea region, disrupting the commercial networks that had linked Aksum to the Mediterranean world. Environmental degradation, including deforestation and soil erosion in the Ethiopian highlands, may have undermined the agricultural base that fed the population. The kingdom did not fall in a single dramatic collapse. It contracted, shifted its center of gravity away from the declining trade routes, and eventually transformed into something quite different from what it had been at its peak. But there is a crucial difference between Aksum and Funan, a difference that illuminates why some civilizations are remembered and others are not. Aksum survived in memory because it left heirs. The Ethiopian kingdom that succeeded it maintained a continuous cultural and political tradition that preserved the memory of Aksum as an ancestral glory. The Aksumite script evolved into the Ge'ez script, which remains in use in Ethiopian religious and scholarly contexts to this day. The Christian church that Aksum established became the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world. The monumental stelae at Aksum were never buried or forgotten. They remained visible and venerated objects throughout the centuries that followed. Aksum, in other words, was remembered because its cultural descendants had both the ability and the motivation to remember it. Funan had no such heirs. The successor state of Chenla, and later the Khmer Empire, did not maintain a continuous tradition of memory linking them to Funan. Whatever cultural inheritance they received was absorbed, transformed, and eventually dissociated from its Funanese origins. Funan became, in the language of cultural memory, an orphan civilization, a kingdom with no one to remember it after it was gone. The case of the ancestral Puebloans offers yet another variation on this theme, one that is important to examine in greater detail because it challenges one of our most deeply held assumptions about civilizational collapse: the assumption that collapse is inherently tragic. Modern Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblo communities, understand the departure from Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon not as a catastrophe but as a migration, a conscious movement undertaken in response to changing conditions and guided by cultural and spiritual imperatives. In the oral traditions of many Pueblo communities, the ancestors did not flee their homes in panic. They left because it was time to leave, because the spiritual and practical circumstances that had made those places appropriate for habitation had changed, and because their traditions taught them that movement was a natural and necessary part of the human relationship with the land. This understanding stands in sharp contrast to the archaeological narrative of collapse and abandonment, which tends to frame the departure as a failure, an inability to cope with drought and social stress. The difference between these two narratives, the archaeological and the indigenous, raises fundamental questions about who gets to define what constitutes the end of a civilization, and whether ending is always the same thing as failure. This question has direct relevance to Funan. We describe Funan's decline as a collapse, a failure, a disappearance. But we describe it this way because we are adopting the perspective of outside observers, primarily Chinese chroniclers and modern Western archaeologists, for whom Funan existed as a political and commercial entity. From that perspective, when the political entity ceased to exist and the commercial activity ceased to flow, Funan was finished. But from the perspective of the people who actually lived in the Mekong Delta, the situation may have looked quite different. They did not disappear. They continued to live, to farm, to fish, to raise their children, to worship their gods. What ended was not their existence, but their visibility to the outside world. The political superstructure collapsed, but the human substratum endured. Whether the people of the Delta experienced this transition as a catastrophe or as a release from the burdens of an increasingly dysfunctional political system is a question we cannot answer because they left no account of their own experience. Their silence on this point is perhaps the greatest of all the silences that surround Funan's story. Let us also examine the case of the Bronze Age collapse in somewhat greater detail because it illustrates a mechanism of civilizational failure that is directly relevant to understanding Funan's vulnerability. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was a system, a tightly integrated network of political, economic, and cultural relationships that linked the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Mycenaean palatial states of Greece, the city-states of the Levantine coast, and the island kingdom of Cyprus into a mutually dependent whole. The system functioned because each part supplied something that the other parts needed. Cyprus provided copper. Anatolia and the Levant provided tin. Egypt provided grain. Mycenae provided finished bronze goods and military services. The palace economies coordinated production and distribution through a system of centralized administration, managed trade, and diplomatic gift exchange that kept the entire network in operation. Goods, messages, and royal brides moved along well-established routes that had been in use for centuries. Treaties govern relations between the great powers. A shared diplomatic language, Akkadian, facilitated communication across linguistic boundaries. When this system collapsed, it did not simply produce a collection of individual failures. It produced a cascading, interconnected catastrophe in which the failure of one component accelerated the failure of others. When the Hittite Empire fell, the tin trade was disrupted. Without tin, bronze could not be produced. Without bronze, weapons and tools could not be manufactured. Without weapons, armies could not be equipped. Without armies, cities could not be defended. Without cities, trade could not be organized. Without trade, economies could not function. The cascade is clear in retrospect, but it would have been difficult to predict in advance because each link in the chain appeared to be strong and stable when viewed in isolation. It was only when the system was stressed simultaneously at multiple points that its hidden fragilities were exposed. Funan's position within the maritime trade network of ancient Asia was structurally analogous to the position of any individual polity within the late Bronze Age Mediterranean system. It was strong as long as the system was functioning, but its strength depended on the continued functioning of partners and pathways over which it had no control. When those external conditions changed, Funan's internal strengths counted for nothing. There is one additional case that deserves attention, not because it is widely known, but precisely because it is not. The Tiwanaku civilization of the Bolivian Altiplano, centered around Lake Titicaca, at an elevation of nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, developed one of the most ingenious agricultural systems in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Tiwanaku system of raised field agriculture involved the construction of elevated planting platforms separated by channels of water. The water in the channels absorbed heat from the sun during the day and released it at night, creating a microclimate around the raised fields that protected crops from the killing frosts that are a constant threat at high altitudes. The system was remarkably productive, capable of supporting a dense urban population in an environment that would otherwise be marginal for agriculture. The capital city of Tiwanaku with its monumental stone architecture and sophisticated artistic traditions, was the center of a cultural sphere that extended across much of the central Andes. Around 1000 of the Common Era, the Tiwanaku civilization collapsed. The cause, now supported by multiple lines of paleoclimatic evidence, appears to have been a prolonged drought that lowered the level of Lake Titicaca and disrupted the hydrological conditions on which the raised field system depended. Without adequate water in the channels, the microclimate effect ceased to function, and the crops were exposed to the full force of the Altiplano's harsh climate. Agricultural production declined. The population dispersed. The monumental center was abandoned. The story is by now familiar. A civilization built on a specific set of environmental conditions that proved to be temporary, its engineering achievements powerless against the scale and duration of the climatic shift that ultimately destroyed its foundation. The recurring elements across these cases are too consistent to be coincidental. In each case, civilization achieved remarkable things by developing sophisticated responses to the specific conditions of its environment. In each case, those conditions proved to be less stable than the civilization assumed. In each case, the civilization's very success, its growth in population, its expansion of infrastructure, its deepening dependence on its engineered systems, made it more vulnerable to disruption rather than less. And in each case, the civilization's decline was accompanied by significant, sometimes nearly total, loss of the knowledge and cultural achievements that had made it distinctive. Now let us turn to a case that challenges our understanding from a completely different direction. Göbekli Tepe, located in southeastern Turkey near the modern city of Sanliurfa, is a site that has fundamentally altered our picture of early human civilizational capacity. Brought to wider archaeological attention in 1994 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circular and rectangular enclosures. Scientific dating methods estimate the oldest of these structures to be approximately 11,600 years old, which would make them among the oldest known monumental constructions built by human communities, predating the earliest known cities in Mesopotamia by several thousand years, and predating the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 7,000 years. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are enormous. Some stand more than 5 meters tall and weigh up to 10 metric tons. They are decorated with carved reliefs depicting animals including lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions, and vultures, executed with a level of artistic skill and confidence that suggests a well-developed sculptural tradition. The engineering required to quarry, transport, shape, and erect these pillars would have required significant organized labor and coordinated effort. This finding was deeply surprising to scholars because, at the time Göbekli Tepe was apparently built and used, the people of the region are understood to have been primarily hunter-gatherers who had not yet adopted settled agriculture. The idea that communities without permanent settlements and surplus food production could build such a complex was, and remains, revolutionary. But here is the truly unsettling aspect of Göbekli Tepe, the detail that connects it to the larger story we are telling. The site was deliberately buried, sometime around 8,000 years before the Common Era, according to current estimates. The entire complex was intentionally filled in with soil, rubble, and debris, concealing the stone pillars and enclosures beneath an artificial hill. For the next roughly 10,000 years, the site was known only as a low mound on the landscape, used by farmers for their fields, unremarkable and unremarked upon by anyone. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe effectively chose to erase their own achievement, and they succeeded so thoroughly that one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era lay hidden beneath agricultural land until the late 20th century. Why was it buried? No one knows. Schmidt speculated that the burial was itself a ritual act, a kind of sacred closing ceremony. Others have suggested more practical explanations, but the essential mystery persists. From the deliberate burial of the ancient past, let us move to the voluntary abandonment of thriving cities. The ancestral Puebloans, sometimes referred to in older literature by the Navajo term Anasazi, inhabited the Four Corners region of the American Southwest for roughly 2,000 years. Their most famous constructions are the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in Colorado and the great houses of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, architectural achievements that demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of masonry, astronomy, and the organization of complex communities in an arid landscape. At its peak, the Chaco system connected dozens of communities across an area of roughly 60,000 square kilometers through a network of ceremonial roads, trade routes, and ritual centers. The great house known as Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon contained an estimated 600 rooms and rose to 4 stories in height, making it one of the largest buildings in North America until the 19th century. Then, during the late 13th century of the Common Era, the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their major centers. The cliff dwellings were vacated, the great houses fell silent, the population dispersed southward and eastward over the course of several decades, eventually merging with or giving rise to the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, who maintain living cultural connections to their ancestors to this day. The reasons for this abandonment have been debated for over a century, but the most widely accepted explanation centers on a severe and prolonged drought that struck the Four Corners region in the late 1200s. Tree ring data, which provides extremely precise climate records for the American Southwest going back thousands of years, shows that the period from roughly 1276 to 1299 of the Common Era was one of the driest in the region's recorded environmental history. For a civilization that depended on rain-fed agriculture in a landscape already operating at the margins of what agriculture could sustain, such a prolonged drought would have been genuinely catastrophic. The parallels with Funan are again instructive. Both civilizations were built on environmental conditions that proved to be temporary or unreliable over the long term. Funan depended on specific maritime trade routes and hydrological conditions that shifted during the 5th and 6th centuries. Ancestral Puebloans depended on rainfall patterns that could sustain agriculture in an otherwise arid landscape. When those conditions changed in ways that exceeded the capacity of their societies to adapt, both civilizations found themselves unable to continue as before, and both responded not with a last desperate stand but with dispersal, their populations scattering to new locations where conditions were more favorable. This is a pattern of civilizational ending that does not fit our usual narratives of conquest and collapse. It is quieter, it is slower, and it is, in its own way, more complete. Now consider the case of the Khmer Empire, the civilization that rose directly from the political and cultural foundations that Funan and Chenla had laid. The Khmer Empire, which flourished from the 9th century to the 15th century of the Common Era, was one of the largest, wealthiest, and most architecturally ambitious states in all of Southeast Asian history. At its peak under kings like Jayavarman VII, it controlled much of modern Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. Its capital at Angkor was home to an estimated population of 750,000 to 1 million people, making it arguably the largest city in the pre-industrial world. The Temple of Angkor Wat, built during the reign of King Suravaman II in the early 12th century, remains to this day the largest religious monument ever constructed by human hands, a structure of such scale and intricacy that European explorers who encountered it in the 16th century refused to believe it could have been built by the local population, and yet the Khmer Empire also collapsed. By the 15th century, Angkor had been largely abandoned, its great temples slowly being consumed by the roots of strangler figs and silk cotton trees. The causes of the Khmer collapse have been the subject of intense scholarly investigation in recent decades, particularly after a team led by the archaeologist Damien Evans used airborne LiDAR technology in 2012 to penetrate the forest canopy and reveal the true extent of the Angkorian settlement. Evans and his colleagues discovered that the area around Angkor was far more extensively urbanized than anyone had previously believed. The LiDAR data showed a sprawling low-density urban landscape covering roughly 1,000 square kilometers, connected by roads, canals, and an elaborate water management system that included massive reservoirs, known as barrays, some of which were several kilometers long. The emerging picture of the Khmer collapse is one of a civilization that pushed its water management infrastructure to the absolute limit of what it could sustain. The Khmer Empire's prosperity depended on its ability to capture, store, and distribute the monsoon rains through a network of barriers, canals, and dikes. Dendrochronological data, the study of tree rings, and other climate proxies suggest that the 14th and 15th centuries brought a period of intensified climate variability to the region, with alternating episodes of severe drought and unusually heavy monsoon rainfall. This whipsawing between extremes may have overwhelmed a water management system designed for more predictable conditions. Reservoirs overflowed during extreme floods. Canals dried up during prolonged droughts. The system, designed to buffer against normal variability, could not cope with the extremes. Agricultural production declined. The population, unable to feed itself at former levels, dispersed. The Khmer collapse is particularly relevant to Funan's story because it demonstrates that the same region, the lowlands and river systems of mainland Southeast Asia, produced not one but at least two major civilizations that rose and fell in response to environmental and economic pressures operating over centuries. Funan built canals. The Khmer built barrays. Both achieved remarkable feats of hydraulic engineering, and both ultimately proved vulnerable to changes in the very environmental conditions that their engineering was designed to exploit. The land that swallowed Funan tried to swallow Angkor too, and in the end it succeeded. Let us now turn to one of the most mysterious episodes in ancient history, one that occurred thousands of kilometers from the Mekong Delta, but that illuminates the same fundamental dynamics. In the final decades of the 13th century and the early decades of the 12th century, before the Common Era, a wave of destruction swept across the eastern Mediterranean, bringing to an end the interconnected civilization of the Late Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the era, collapsed utterly. Cities along the coast of the Levant, including the great trading center of Ugarit, were destroyed and never reoccupied. Egypt, under Ramesses III, fought off seaborne invaders in a series of desperate battles commemorated in temple inscriptions at Medinet Habu. The attackers are referred to in Egyptian records as peoples of the sea, a term that covers groups including the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, and others whose exact origins remain debated to this day. The archaeologist Eric Klein, in his study of the Late Bronze Age collapse, argued that the Sea Peoples were not the sole cause of the catastrophe, but rather one element in what he called a systems collapse, a cascade of interconnected failures that brought down the entire Eastern Mediterranean system simultaneously. Drought, earthquake, disruption of trade networks, internal social unrest, and the attacks of migrating peoples all played their respective roles. No single cause was sufficient on its own, but together they overwhelmed the capacity of late Bronze Age societies to maintain themselves. The relevance to Funan should be clear. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was a tightly integrated system of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence, much like the maritime networks that sustained Funan 2,000 years later. And in both cases, the disruption of those networks produced consequences that cascaded far beyond what any single actor or event could have caused alone. Consider also the case of Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, located near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, in what is now the state of Illinois. Cahokia was a city of an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people, at its peak around 1100 of the Common Era. Its central feature, a massive earthen mound known as Monk's Mound, rises roughly 30 meters above the surrounding floodplain and contains an estimated 622,000 cubic meters of earth, all of it moved by hand without draft animals or wheeled vehicles. The construction of Monk's Mound alone would have required millions of individual basket loads of soil, carried on the backs of workers over the course of many decades. Cahokia was the center of Mississippian culture, which extended across much of the eastern United States, and it maintained long-distance trade connections reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. By roughly 1300 of the Common Era, Cahokia was abandoned. The population declined precipitously. The political system fragmented. The great mounds were left to erode and to be overgrown by prairie grass. When European explorers first encountered the site centuries later, the mounds were still visible, but the people who had built them were gone, and no living community claimed direct descent from the city's founders. The causes of Cahokia's decline remain debated, with proposals ranging from environmental degradation caused by deforestation and soil exhaustion to social upheaval and political fragmentation. What is not debated is the result. A city that was once the largest and most complex urban centre in an entire continent was reduced to a collection of grass-covered mounds that puzzled and mystified later observers. The numbers are striking when we step back and survey this broader landscape of civilizational disappearance. Funan, the Indus Valley, the ancestral Puebloans, the Khmer Empire, Cahokia, Aksum, the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, and these are only the most prominent examples. There are dozens of others. The Nok culture of West Africa, which produced some of the earliest known terracotta sculptures south of the Sahara, and then vanished from the archaeological record. The Tiwanaku civilization of the Bolivian Altiplano, which built a monumental capital at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, and then collapsed around 1000 of the Common Era, when changing rainfall patterns undermined its raised field agricultural system. The Moche civilization of coastal Peru, whose magnificent pyramids and elaborate pottery traditions flourished for centuries before environmental instability and social crises, brought the culture to an end around the 7th century of the Common Era. Each of these civilizations represents a unique human achievement. Each developed distinctive solutions to the challenges of its particular environment. Each produced art, architecture, social organization, and knowledge that reflected a particular understanding of the world and humanity's place within it. And each, in its own way and for its own reasons, ceased to exist. The knowledge accumulated by these societies was not passed down in its entirety to their successors. It was partially transmitted, partially transformed, and partially lost. The degree of loss varies from case to case, but in every case, the loss was significant. And in some cases, including Funan's, the loss was nearly total. What these cases collectively reveal is not merely that civilizations can fall. Everyone knows that. What they reveal is something more subtle and more troubling, that the mode of a civilization's falling determines whether it is remembered at all. Civilizations that collapse violently in fire and conquest leave dramatic traces that capture the imagination of future generations. Troy, Pompeii, Carthage, Tenochtitlan. These are names that echo through the centuries precisely because their endings were catastrophic and visible. But civilizations that decline gradually, that drain away through economic marginalization, environmental change, and slow demographic dispersal, leave almost nothing behind. They do not burn, so there is no ash. They do not shatter, so there are no fragments. They simply dissolve, and dissolved civilizations do not become legends. They become gaps in the record, silences in the archive, blank spaces on the map where something ought to be but is not. There is a further dimension to these comparative cases that deserves explicit articulation, because it bears directly on the question of why Funan's disappearance matters. Each of the civilizations we have discussed, the Indus Valley, Göbekli Tepe, the ancestral Puebloans, the Khmer Empire, the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, Cahokia, Aksum, Tiwanaku, represents not just a lost political entity, but a lost experiment in human possibility. Each civilization was, in its own way, an answer to the question of how human beings can organize themselves to survive, prosper, and create meaning in a particular environment. Each answer was different, because each environment was different, and each culture brought its own history, its own values, and its own creative imagination to the problem. And when each civilization collapsed, its particular answers was lost or diminished, reducing the total repertoire of solutions available to humanity as a whole. This is a loss that cannot be measured in economic terms or quantified in archaeological reports. It is a loss of possibility, a narrowing of the range of demonstrated alternatives for how human societies can be organized. When the Indus Valley civilization collapsed, the world lost a model of urban planning and public sanitation that would not be equaled in the region for 2 millennia. When the ancestral Puebloans dispersed, the world lost a model of complex community organization in arid environments that had been refined over centuries of practice. When Funan disappeared, the world lost a model of maritime commercial statecraft, a demonstration that a kingdom could be built on trade rather than territory, on connectivity rather than conquest, on the management of flows rather than the control of land. That model was partially inherited by Srivijaya and other Southeast Asian maritime polities, but Funan's specific version of it, adapted to the unique conditions of the Mekong Delta, was gone forever. The cumulative effect of these losses across the span of human history is staggering when contemplated in its full scope. We do not know how many civilizations have existed and been forgotten entirely, leaving no trace whatsoever in the archaeological record. We do not know how many solutions to the problems of human existence have been developed, tested, refined, and then lost without a trace. What we do know, from the cases we have managed to recover, is that the number is large and the range of lost possibilities is vast. Every blank space on the map of human history is not empty. It is full of people who lived, worked, loved, built, and knew things that we will never know. The silence of the archaeological record is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of presence that has been erased. This is the category to which Funan belongs. It did not fall in a single dramatic event that would have been recorded by shocked observers. It was not sacked by barbarian hordes in a night of fire and slaughter. It was not buried under volcanic ash to be preserved for future archaeologists. It simply became irrelevant. The trade route shifted, the canals silted up, the people moved away, and over the course of a few generations, a kingdom that had connected the greatest empires of the ancient world was erased from human memory as completely as if it had never existed at all. There is a deeper truth buried within the story of Funan, and it is one that applies not only to that vanished kingdom, but to every complex society that has ever existed, including our own. The truth is this: what we call civilization is not a permanent condition, it is a temporary arrangement. A set of conditions comes together, a fertile landscape, a strategic location, a moment of technological or organizational advantage, and human beings exploit those conditions to build something remarkable. Cities rise, trade networks form, knowledge accumulates, institutions take shape, and for a time, perhaps a few centuries, perhaps 1,000 years, the arrangement holds. It seems solid. It seems permanent. It seems like the natural order of things. But the conditions are always changing. Rivers shift course, climates fluctuate, trade routes move in response to new technologies and new political realities. And when the conditions that gave rise to a civilization change faster than the civilization can adapt, the civilization ceases to exist. Not because its people were foolish or incompetent, but because the foundation upon which they built was never as solid as it appeared. Let that sink in. The people of Funan were not primitive. They were not isolated from the wider currents of their world. They were sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and deeply connected to the most powerful civilizations of their age. They traded with empires that spanned continents. They built engineering works that lasted for centuries. They adopted and adapted the religious, artistic, and political ideas of multiple civilizations, creating a unique cultural synthesis that was entirely their own. And none of it was enough to save them from the slow, grinding process of environmental and economic change that rendered their kingdom obsolete. Their sophistication did not protect them. Their wealth did not sustain them. Their connections to the wider world did not prevent their marginalization. In the end, the Delta itself decided that Funan's time was over. This is not science fiction. This is the documented history of a real civilization that existed in a real place for roughly 500 years. And the pattern that destroyed Funan, the pattern of dependence on conditions that prove to be temporary, is the same pattern that underlies every civilizational collapse in the historical record. The American anthropologist Joseph Tainter, in his influential study of civilizational collapse, published in 1988, argued that complex societies are inherently vulnerable to what he called diminishing marginal returns on complexity. As societies grow more complex, they require ever greater resources to maintain their administrative, military, and infrastructure systems. At first, these investments yield significant returns: increased agricultural production, expanded trade, greater security, richer cultural life. But over time, the returns diminish. Each additional unit of complexity produces less benefit while consuming more resources. Eventually, the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the benefits it provides. At that point, the society either simplifies voluntarily, shedding complexity to reduce costs, or it collapses involuntarily when it can no longer sustain the burden of its own organizational weight. Funan fits Tainter's model with disturbing precision. The canal system that connected the kingdom's agricultural hinterland to its ports required constant maintenance in a landscape that was perpetually shifting beneath the engineer's feet. The trade network that sustained the kingdom's wealth required the continued cooperation of trading partners, scattered across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The administrative system that coordinated labor, collected taxes, maintained the navy, and organized religious ceremonies required a functioning central authority with legitimacy, resources, and competence. Each of these systems depended on the others in a web of mutual reliance, and when one element began to fail, the failures cascaded through the entire structure. Consider the canal system in isolation. Maintaining canals in the Mekong Delta is not a one-time investment. It is a perpetual struggle against sedimentation, flooding, erosion, and channel migration. Every monsoon season deposits new layers of silt. Every dry season sees evaporation and contraction. The canals must be dredged, repaired, reinforced, and sometimes entirely rebuilt on a continuous basis. This constant maintenance requires organized labor. Organized labor requires a functioning administrative system. A functioning administrative system requires tax revenue. Tax revenue requires a functioning economy. A functioning economy requires working trade, networks, and productive agriculture. And productive agriculture, in the Mekong Delta, requires functioning canals. The circularity of this dependency is obvious once it is stated, and it is precisely this circularity that makes the system so fragile. Remove any single element, and the entire circuit breaks. The canal system fails without labor. Labor cannot be organized without administration. Administration cannot function without revenue. Revenue depends on trade and agriculture. Trade and agriculture depend on the canals. It is a closed loop, and a closed loop can be broken at any point. The historian and archaeologist Roland Fletcher has studied this pattern of vulnerability in the context of what he calls low-density agrarian urbanism, a distinctive pattern of settlement in which large populations are spread across extensive areas and connected by engineered infrastructure rather than concentrated within compact urban cores. Fletcher argues that civilizations built on this model, which includes both Funan and the later Khmer Empire, are particularly vulnerable to infrastructure failure. In a compact city, people can survive the failure of external systems for some period of time simply by virtue of their physical proximity. They can cooperate, share resources, and maintain social bonds through face-to-face interaction. But in a dispersed, infrastructure-dependent settlement pattern, the failure of the connecting systems, the canals, the roads, the communication networks, leads rapidly to fragmentation and isolation. Communities that were previously connected become isolated nodes, unable to coordinate with each other, unable to contribute to collective maintenance, unable to sustain the level of social organization that had previously sustained them. Let that sink in. The very features that made Funan impressive, its vast canal network, its dispersed settlement pattern across the delta, its far-reaching maritime trade connections, were also the features that made it structurally fragile. The more extensive the network, the more points at which it could fail. The more dispersed the population, the more dependent it was on the infrastructure that connected its parts. The more far-flung the trade connections, the more vulnerable the economy was to disruptions that originated thousands of kilometers away and were entirely beyond local control. Size and complexity did not confer resilience. They conferred vulnerability. And that vulnerability, once exposed by changing conditions, could not be reversed. The geographer and historian Jared Diamond, in his comparative study of civilizational collapses, identified 5 factors that contribute to societal failure: environmental damage, climate change, hostile neighbors, declining support from friendly trading partners, and a society's response to its environmental problems. Diamond's framework, while criticized by some scholars for oversimplifying complex processes, provides a useful checklist for evaluating the relative weight of different contributing factors. In Funan's case, all 5 of Diamond's factors appear to have been present to some degree. Environmental damage in the form of canal degradation and possible deforestation. Climate change in the form of shifting monsoon patterns that altered the hydrological regime of the delta. Hostile neighbors in the form of the rising power of Chenla and the competition from Srivijayan ports. Declining support from trading partners as the maritime routes shifted away from Funan's ports. And a societal response to environmental problems that, whatever form it took, was ultimately insufficient to arrest the decline. But Diamond's framework, useful as it is, does not capture what is perhaps the most important aspect of Funan's collapse, the self-reinforcing nature of the process. Each of the 5 factors Diamond identifies interacted with the others in ways that amplified the overall effect. Environmental damage reduced agricultural productivity, which reduced the revenue available for canal maintenance, which accelerated further environmental damage. Climate change disrupted trade patterns, which reduced the resources available for responding to climate change. The loss of trading partners reduced the kingdom's strategic importance, which weakened its position relative to Chenla, which further reduced its ability to maintain its trading network. Each failure compounded every other failure. The process was not linear but exponential, not a gradual decline but an accelerating spiral. This spiral dynamic is what makes civilizational collapse so difficult to reverse. By the time the decline becomes apparent to the people living through it, the feedback loops are already well established, and the resources needed to break them are precisely the resources that the decline has already consumed. A king who wanted to dredge the canals needed labor. To command labor, he needed political authority. To maintain political authority, he needed military power and patronage resources. Military power and patronage resources required revenue from trade and agriculture. Trade and agriculture required functioning canals. The circle was complete, and within that circle, there was no point of leverage where the process could be arrested by any single intervention, however well conceived. What was needed was a simultaneous renewal of all the system's components, and that kind of comprehensive renewal was beyond the capacity of any individual ruler or generation. This is the cruel mathematics of complex systems. They are efficient going up. Each new element reinforces the others, and the whole grows faster than the sum of its parts. But they are equally efficient going down. Each failing element undermines the others, and the whole collapses faster than any individual component would on its own. The same interdependence that created Funan's strength created its fragility. The same connections that amplified prosperity amplified decline. There is no version of Funan's story in which the kingdom enjoyed the benefits of its complexity without also assuming the risks. The benefits and the risks were the same thing, viewed from different moments in time. The environmental historian William Cronon has written extensively about the relationship between human societies and the landscapes they inhabit, arguing that what we call nature and what we call civilization are not separate categories but deeply entangled systems that co-create each other. Cronon's insight applies with particular force to Funan. The Mekong Delta that sustained Funan was not a pristine natural landscape that the Funanese merely occupied. It was a co-produced environment, shaped over centuries by the interaction of human engineering and natural processes. The canals altered the flow of water across the delta. The clearing of land for rice cultivation changed patterns of sedimentation and erosion. The construction of ports and settlements modified the coastline. Funan did not merely sit upon the delta. It remade the delta in its own image. And when Funan collapsed, the delta began to unmake itself, reverting to a state that was no longer optimized for human use. The canals silted up not merely because no one maintained them, but because the entire hydrological system that the canals had been designed to manage reasserted its own logic, a logic that had been temporarily overridden by human effort, but that was always waiting to reassert itself. This understanding reframes the story of Funan's collapse in a way that removes some of its apparent contingency. Funan did not fall because of bad luck or poor leadership or a single unfortunate event. It fell because the project of maintaining a complex civilization in the Mekong Delta was, over the long run, a project of swimming against a current. The delta's natural tendency was to shift, to silt, to flood, to migrate. Funan's engineers held that tendency at bay for 5 centuries, which is a remarkable achievement. But they could not hold it at bay forever, because the energy required to maintain the system against its natural tendencies had to be continuously supplied, and any interruption in that supply, whether caused by economic decline, political instability, or environmental change, would allow the natural tendencies to reassert themselves. The delta was not Funan's enemy, it was Funan's foundation. But a foundation that is constantly trying to rearrange itself beneath your feet is not a foundation you can trust indefinitely. The knowledge dimension of this loss deserves deeper consideration than it usually receives. We tend to think of knowledge as something that, once discovered, remains permanently available. We think of it as cumulative, each generation adding to the stock bequeathed by the previous one. And in our own era, with our libraries, databases, and digital archives, this model is largely accurate. But for most of human history, knowledge was carried primarily in living minds and transmitted through personal instruction, apprenticeship, and oral tradition. This mode of transmission is remarkably effective, as long as the chain of transmission remains unbroken. A master craftsman teaches an apprentice, who becomes a master and teaches another apprentice, and so on through the generations. The knowledge is updated, refined, and adapted with each iteration. But if the chain is broken, if a generation fails to train the next, the knowledge is gone, not stored somewhere waiting to be retrieved, gone, irretrievably, permanently gone. Funan's canal engineers carried their knowledge in this way. They knew things that no modern scholar knows, things about the behavior of water and silt in the specific conditions of the Mekong Delta, things about the properties of specific soils, the timing of specific floods, the best methods for excavating and lining canals in a landscape with a water table mere centimeters below the surface. This knowledge was not written down in any text that has survived, if it was ever written down at all. It was carried in the minds and hands of people who learned it by doing it, generation after generation, for 500 years. When those people dispersed, when the communities that sustained the practice dissolved, the knowledge went with them. Some fragments may have survived in diminished form, passed down in local traditions of water management that continued in the delta long after Funan's political dissolution. But the integrated system of knowledge, the comprehensive understanding that enabled the construction and maintenance of a kingdom-wide canal network, was lost. The same is true of Funan's navigational knowledge, its diplomatic protocols, its administrative practices, its religious ceremonies, its artistic traditions. Each of these domains represented centuries of accumulated expertise, and each was vulnerable to the same mechanism of loss. Knowledge that exists only in practice, in the doing of things by skilled people within functioning institutions, cannot survive the dissolution of those institutions. It is not like a book that can sit on a shelf, unread for centuries, and then be opened again. It is like a fire that must be continuously fed, or it goes out, and once it goes out, it cannot be relit from the ashes. This observation has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between civilizational achievement and civilizational durability. We tend to equate complexity with strength. We assume, often without examining the assumption, that a more complex civilization is a more resilient one. But the evidence from Funan, from the Khmer Empire, from the Indus Valley, from the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, and from many other cases consistently suggests the opposite conclusion. Complexity creates dependencies. Dependencies create vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities, given sufficient time, are always exploited by the relentless forces of environmental, economic, and social change. The more complex the system, the more ways it can fail, and the more ways it can fail, the more certain it is that eventually some combination of failures will overwhelm it. There is one final dimension to the story of Funan's decline that may be the most important of all, and it concerns the loss of knowledge. When Funan declined, It did not merely lose its territory and its wealth and its political authority. It lost its institutional memory, the accumulated knowledge of how to do all the things that made Funan what it was. The techniques for building and maintaining canals in the specific conditions of the Mekong Delta, the navigational knowledge that guided ships through the shifting channels and treacherous coastal waters, the diplomatic protocols that maintained productive trade relationships with distant courts, the religious traditions that gave meaning, coherence, and moral authority to the social order, the administrative practices that organized labor, collected taxes, dispensed justice, and coordinated collective action across a dispersed territory. All of this knowledge accumulated through 5 centuries of practice, experiment, failure, and refinement was dissipated when the society that carried it ceased to function as a coherent whole. Some of this knowledge was probably transmitted to the successor state of Chenla, and eventually, through further transformations, to the Khmer Empire. But how much was lost in the transition? How much was garbled, simplified, or abandoned? We cannot know, because we do not know the full extent of what Funan's knowledge base contained. We know the outputs of that knowledge, the canals, the ports, the temples, the trade connections, the political alliances. But we do not know the inputs, the specific techniques, the organizational methods, the unwritten rules of thumb, the accumulated wisdom of generations of engineers and administrators and navigators and diplomats who made those outputs possible. And what we do not know, we cannot measure. The loss is invisible to us precisely because the thing that was lost has left no trace. This is the deepest and most troubling lesson of Funan's story. It is not simply that a kingdom disappeared. It is that an entire body of knowledge, an entire way of understanding and operating within the world, was destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. And this destruction was not the work of a foreign conqueror burning libraries or smashing monuments. It was the natural, inevitable, and entirely unremarkable consequence of a society's dissolution. When the people dispersed, they carried fragments of their knowledge with them, the way a broken mirror scatters pieces of light. But the integrated whole, the totality of what Funan knew and could do, the complete system that existed only as a collective property of the civilization itself, was gone forever. No single person carried it all. No single community preserved it all. It existed only in the relationships between people, in the institutions that coordinated their work, in the traditions that transmitted skills from one generation to the next. When those relationships and institutions and traditions dissolved, the knowledge dissolved with them. What does the story of Funan mean for us today? Not as abstract history, not as an academic exercise in reconstructing the past, but as a reflection on the nature of human achievement and its relationship to the passage of time. We live in an era of unprecedented scale and interconnection. The global economic system links billions of people across every continent through supply chains of staggering complexity. The digital infrastructure that supports modern communication, finance, and governance processes more information in a single day than was produced in the entirety of Funan's 500-year existence. The engineering capabilities of modern civilization dwarf anything that has come before in recorded history, and yet the fundamental dynamics that govern the rise and fall of complex societies have not changed. Trade routes still shift in response to technological innovation and political realignment. Environmental conditions still fluctuate in ways that challenge human adaptation. Infrastructure still requires constant investment and maintenance. Knowledge is still vulnerable to loss when the institutions that carry it fail. The Mekong Delta, where Funan once flourished, is today one of the most threatened landscapes on Earth. Rising sea levels are encroaching on the delta at an accelerating pace. Upstream dam construction on the Mekong River, particularly in China and Laos, is altering sediment flows and depriving the delta of the material it needs to maintain its elevation against the encroaching sea. Groundwater extraction by the millions of people who now inhabit the delta is causing the land to subside, sinking the surface even as the waters rise. According to scientific projections published in recent decades, significant portions of the Mekong Delta could face severe flooding and salinization within the next few decades, potentially displacing millions of people and disrupting one of the world's most productive agricultural regions. There is a profound irony in this situation that is impossible to ignore. The delta that consumed Funan, that swallowed its canals and buried its cities beneath layers of silt and vegetation, is itself now under threat of being consumed. The forces of geological and climatic change that erased one civilization are now threatening the lives and livelihoods of the millions who inhabit the same landscape today. The lesson of Funan is not merely that civilizations can fall, it is that the conditions that support human habitation in any given place are always temporary, even when they seem permanent. What appears stable is merely slow, what appears permanent is merely patient, and what patience conceals, time eventually reveals. The parallel between Funan and the modern Mekong Delta is not merely poetic, it is structural. The same geographic features that made the delta attractive for human settlement in the first century of the Common Era, its fertile soil, its abundant water, its proximity to major maritime routes, continue to attract human settlement today. And the same geographic features that made the delta treacherous, its low elevation, its susceptibility to flooding and salinization, its dependence on the continued flow of sediment from upstream, continue to pose existential threats. The current inhabitants of the Mekong Delta are engaged in the same fundamental project that the people of Funan pursued, the engineering of a viable human habitat in a landscape that is not naturally inclined to cooperate. They build dikes where Funan built canals. They pump groundwater where Funan diverted surface water. They grow rice in paddies that may, in some cases, overlie the rice paddies of Funan itself. The technology is different, but the challenge is identical. And the fundamental vulnerability of a human community that depends on engineered control of a dynamic natural system is unchanged. What has changed, and changed dramatically, is the scale. Funan's population is estimated to have been in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps reaching 1 million at its peak. The population of the Mekong Delta today exceeds 17 million. The stakes of a collapse in the delta's habitability are correspondingly higher, and the speed of the environmental changes currently threatening the delta is faster, in some respects, than anything Funan experienced. Sea level rise, land subsidence, and upstream dam construction are altering the delta's hydrology on a timescale of decades rather than centuries. The people of Funan had the luxury, if it can be called that, of experiencing their decline gradually over several generations. The people of the modern Mekong Delta may not have that luxury. The forces acting on the delta today are operating with a speed and an inevitability that may compress the process of displacement and adaptation into a single human lifetime. The political theorist and philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about what she called the human condition, the fundamental circumstances that define human existence on Earth. Among those circumstances, Arendt identified natality and mortality, action and labour, and the tension between the private world of the household and the public world of political life. But underlying all of these, she argued, was a more basic condition. The fact that human beings exist on a planet whose physical processes are indifferent to human purposes. The Earth provides the material foundation for all human activity, but it does not organize itself for human convenience. It erupts, floods, freezes, and shifts according to its own rhythms. Human civilization is the attempt to impose order on this indifferent substrate, to create a realm of meaning and purpose within a physical world that has neither. Funan's story illustrates Arendt's insight with painful clarity. The people of Funan created a world of meaning, a kingdom with gods and kings and merchants and priests, within a physical environment that was entirely indifferent to whether that kingdom existed or not. When the physical conditions shifted, the kingdom dissolved, and the physical environment continued on its way without the slightest perturbation. The delta did not notice that Funan had disappeared. It simply continued being a delta. This indifference of the natural world to human purposes is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of humility. It suggests that we would do well to hold our achievements with a lighter grip, to recognize that the systems we have built, however impressive, exist within constraints that we did not create and cannot entirely control. It suggests that we should invest not only in building new things, but in maintaining the things we have already built, because maintenance is what stands between a functioning civilization and a collection of deteriorating artifacts. And it suggests that we should document, preserve, and transmit our knowledge with a sense of urgency that reflects the fragility of the mechanisms by which knowledge is carried forward through time. The library that is not maintained becomes a ruin. The tradition that is not taught becomes a silence. The canal that is not dredged becomes a ditch. These are not metaphors. They are descriptions of processes that have occurred countless times in human history. And that will occur countless times again. The question that Funan poses to the present is not whether our civilization will decline. All civilizations decline. The question is whether we are paying attention to the conditions that sustain us, whether we are investing in the maintenance and renewal of the systems on which we depend, and whether we are transmitting our knowledge in forms that are resilient enough to survive the disruptions that will inevitably come. These are not abstract questions. They are practical questions with practical implications for how we allocate resources, how we design institutions, and how we think about the relationship between human ambition and environmental reality. There is a philosophical dimension to Funan's story that deserves a moment of quiet reflection. The philosopher of history Oswald Spengler, writing in the early 20th century, proposed that civilizations follow a life cycle, analogous to biological organisms, rising from youth through maturity to old age and eventual death. Spengler's model has been criticized for its rigidity, its determinism, and its sometimes questionable assumptions. But its central insight, that civilizations are mortal, that they do not last forever, contains a truth that the story of Funan makes vivid and concrete. Funan was born, it grew, it flourished, it aged, and it died. Its lifespan was roughly 500 years, shorter than many empires, but longer than most modern nation-states have yet endured. During those 5 centuries, uncountable human lives were lived within its borders. Births and deaths, harvests and famines, marriages and funerals, festivals and ordinary days, all of these accumulated into the vast, irretrievable totality of Funan's existence. And now, all that remains are fragments. A name in Chinese records, a few inscriptions in Sanskrit, some foundations of brick, the traces of canals barely visible from the air, a Roman coin in the mud. These fragments are all that stand between Funan and absolute oblivion. Without them, this kingdom would be as unknown to us as the songs its people sang, as the stories its mothers told its children, as the prayers its priests offered to Vishnu and Shiva in temples that have long since crumbled to dust. And here we must pause and confront a question that has no comfortable answer. If Funan, with all its wealth and all its connections and all its centuries of accumulated achievement, could be so thoroughly erased from human memory, what does that tell us about the permanence of our own achievements? We build our cities with the expectation that they will endure. We record our knowledge with the belief that future generations will inherit it. We construct our identities around the assumption that the world we inhabit is fundamentally stable and that the systems that sustain us will continue to function. But stability is an illusion generated by the brevity of human life. We live for 70 or 80 years, rarely more. Within that span, the world seems fixed. The mountains do not visibly move. The rivers do not obviously change course. The cities do not sink into the ground while we watch. But extend the timescale to 500 years, the span of Funan's existence, and everything is in motion. Mountains erode. Rivers migrate across their floodplains. Cities are buried, flooded, abandoned, forgotten. Empires dissolve into the landscapes that once sustained them. 500 years from now, the world will be as different from the present as the present is from the late 1500s. And some of the things that seem most permanent to us, our cities, our institutions, our ways of recording and transmitting knowledge, will be gone. Perhaps that sounds like pessimism. Perhaps it sounds like an argument against building anything at all. But that is not the lesson of Funan. The lesson of Funan is not that building is futile. The lesson is that building is precious precisely because it is temporary. The canals of Funan sustained a civilization for 500 years. That they eventually failed does not diminish the centuries of life and prosperity they made possible. The trade networks of Funan connected distant civilizations and facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and knowledge across vast distances. That those networks eventually shifted does not erase the centuries of mutual enrichment they produced. Funan mattered, its existence mattered, and the fact that it was temporary does not reduce its significance, it amplifies it. We began this journey with a question: how does a civilization that connected Rome to China simply vanish from human memory? And now, after everything we have explored, the answer is clear, even if it brings no comfort. Funan vanished because the conditions that created it changed. The trade routes shifted, the rivers moved, the canals filled with silt. The people drifted away, family by family, village by village, generation by generation. And in the tropical heat of the Mekong Delta, the physical evidence of 5 centuries of human achievement decayed, rotted, dissolved, and returned to the earth from which it had been so briefly raised. This is how civilizations die, not always in fire, not always in conquest, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the slow accumulation of small changes, each one too minor to seem significant on its own, but together forming a current too powerful for any society to resist. The people of Funan did not wake up one morning to find their kingdom gone. They experienced its decline the way we experience the aging of our own bodies, gradually, imperceptibly, one small loss at a time, until the sum of those losses became undeniable, and the world they had known was simply no longer there. Funan was a world, not merely a kingdom, not merely a political entity marked by boundaries on a map, but a world. A world of docks and warehouses, of canal boats and ocean-going ships, of rice paddies shimmering under the monsoon sky and temple festivals celebrating gods brought from across the sea. A world of Sanskrit prayers and monsoon rains, of gold and glass, and the scent of sandalwood carried on the warm sea breeze. A world where a Roman coin could sit beside a Chinese silk in a merchant's strongbox, where a Hindu deity could be worshipped in a temple built by Southeast Asian hands, where the languages and customs of a dozen cultures could be heard in a single market square. That world is gone. It has been gone for more than 1400 years, and nothing we do, no excavation, no translation, no act of scholarly reconstruction, can bring it back in its fullness. But the story of that world, imperfect and fragmentary as it is, still has the power to teach us. It teaches us that prosperity is not permanent. It teaches us that connectivity does not guarantee survival. It teaches us that the most impressive engineering can be undone by the patient, impersonal forces of nature. It teaches us that knowledge, however vast and hard-won, is only as durable as the institutions and communities that carry it forward from one generation to the next. And it teaches us, above all, that forgetting is the most natural thing in the world. We do not have to try to forget. Forgetting happens on its own, effortlessly, inevitably, remorselessly, unless we make a deliberate and sustained effort to remember. The ruins at Ok-Eo do not speak. The silt-choked canals of the Mekong Delta tell no stories. The brick foundations of temples once dedicated to Vishnu and Shiva stand mute in the warm, wet earth. But they are there. They exist. They are the physical proof that something once lived in that place. Something worth remembering. Something worth mourning. Something worth knowing. Funan existed. It mattered. And the fact that most of the world has never heard its name is not a reflection of its insignificance. It is a reflection of ours, of our collective failure to pay attention to the full scope of human history, of our collective willingness to let entire chapters of the human story fall into darkness simply because they were written in languages we never learned, carved into stones that the jungle covered before anyone thought to look, or recorded on palm leaves that the tropical rains dissolved before anyone thought to copy them onto something more permanent. The Mekong flows on. It has flowed for longer than any human civilization has existed, and it will continue to flow long after the civilizations that currently line its banks have joined Funan in the long silence of the past. The river does not mourn. The delta does not remember. Only we can do that. Only we can look at the scattered fragments of Funan's existence, the coins and the carvings, the inscriptions and the canal traces, the accounts of Chinese diplomats, and the patient reconstructions of modern archaeologists, and choose to hold them in our minds as evidence that the world is older, richer, and stranger than we usually permit ourselves to believe. Tonight we have spoken of a kingdom that most people will never encounter in a textbook, a kingdom that ruled the crossroads of the ancient world for 500 years and then disappeared so completely that its very existence was doubted for centuries. We have spoken of canals and commerce, of monsoons and merchants, of Roman gold and Sanskrit prayers. We have spoken of how civilizations die, not always in dramatic spectacle, but sometimes in the quiet, unwitnessed exhaustion of the conditions that sustained them. And we have spoken of what is lost when a civilization dies. Not merely its buildings and its trade goods and its political arrangements, but its entire way of understanding and inhabiting and making sense of the world. There is something almost sacred about the act of remembering a civilization that has been forgotten. Not sacred in a religious sense, though Funan's own gods might appreciate the irony, but sacred in the sense that it represents a choice to resist the most powerful force in human affairs, the force of forgetting. Every culture that has ever existed has fought against forgetting, and every culture has eventually lost that fight, at least in part. The Egyptians carved their histories into stone, and their civilization endured in memory for millennia. But even Egyptian civilization was eventually forgotten by the people who lived in the shadow of its monuments, and it required the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone in the early 19th century to reconnect modern humanity with the world of the pharaohs. The Maya inscribed their history on stelae and in codices, and their civilization persisted in the memory of their descendants long after the great cities of the classic period were abandoned. But the codices were burned by Spanish missionaries, and the script was not deciphered until the late 20th century. If civilizations that carved their records in imperishable stone could be forgotten, what chance did Funan have, with its wooden buildings, and its palm leaf manuscripts, and its canals drawn in water? And yet Funan has not been entirely forgotten. That is the extraordinary thing. Despite every disadvantage, despite the perishability of its building materials, the hostility of its climate, the absence of monumental stone architecture, the silence of its own historical record, Funan has been recovered from the edge of oblivion by the patient, painstaking, often tedious work of scholars who refuse to accept the blank spaces on the map as evidence of emptiness. Louis Malloret, digging in the mud of Oke-Io during the 1940s and 50s, recovered not just artifacts but evidence that a world had existed where the received wisdom said nothing had been. Miriam Stark, working with modern survey techniques and satellite imagery in the 21st century, expanded the picture and deepened the understanding. Pierre-Yves Mangan placed Funan within the broader framework of Southeast Asian maritime history. Michael Vickery challenged comfortable assumptions and forced a more rigorous examination of the evidence. Collectively, these scholars and dozens of others have not restored Funan to life, because that is impossible. But they have restored Funan to memory, which is the next best thing. The mud of the Mekong Delta holds many things. It holds the foundations of temples that once rose above the floodwaters. It holds the traces of canals that once carried boats loaded with the wealth of nations. It holds coins minted in empires that stretched across the ancient world. And it holds the silence of a people who once filled those canals with boats, those temples with prayers, and those ports with the goods of a dozen civilizations. That silence is the true legacy of Funan. Not the gold, not the inscriptions, not the archaeological monographs. The silence. The vast, encompassing, patient silence of a world that was, and is no more. Listen to it. It has something to tell us. Something about who we are, and how little time we have, and how much of what we build will eventually return to the earth from which it came. Funan knew this truth, not because its people were wiser than us, but because they lived it. They built their kingdom on the mud, and the mud took it back. That is the oldest story in the world, and it is not finished yet.